Module 12, the lymphatic system, the second line of innate defense. Much the same way that a castle has several lines of defense to protect it from invaders, your body has more than one line of defense as well. The first line of defense we discussed in the last section behaves kind of like a moat around the castle, stopping or trapping foreign invaders before they make their way in. Well, if a pathogen gets past this first line of defense, or the innate defense, there are other defense mechanisms in the body. They are still part of the innate immunity and thus are nonspecific, the same way that a castle has a gate and high walls to prevent entry if something gets past the moat. This second line in the body includes complement and interferon. Complement is a series of about 30 plasma proteins activated by foreign cells or antibodies to those cells. They lyse bacteria, promote phagocytosis, and promote inflammation. Interferon is protein secreted by cells infected with a virus. These proteins do not save the infected cell, but they stimulate nearby cells to strengthen themselves against a viral invasion. So first we can say that complement is antibacterial. It fights off foreign cells, which are often bacteria. And interferon is antiviral, only affecting viruses. So though these two defense mechanisms aren't specific, they do attack different groups of infectious agents. Like the definition states, complement is made up of about 30 plasma proteins. They're made by the liver and input into the blood. These proteins float around in the bloodstream and remain inactive unless something arrives that activates them. This can be as a result of coming in contact with a foreign invader, or if the proteins come across antibodies bound to antigens, which is a result of foreign invasion too. When they become activated, they can lyse bacteria. Remember that lyse means to disrupt the cell by rupturing its membrane. They do this by binding together in a specific way to form a punch that actually punches a hole in the plasma membrane of invading cells. Then the internal cell material leaks out and the cell dies. You can think of these guys as jousting knights in our castle example, grabbing their horse, their lance, and then riding out to puncture their enemy. So activated complement lyses bacteria. It also attracts phagocytic cells. These cells come in and engulf the dead and dying bacterial cells. A third job of complement is to promote inflammation, which includes localized swelling and redness. This is a good thing when it comes to infections because this signals cells in all other mechanisms and cells that fight the war against invaders to your body. Well, now let's talk about interferon. It's the innate viral defense, made up of a protein that is antiviral. It isn't made in the liver like complement proteins, but rather is made by individual cells. You see, once a virus attacks a cell, that cell will eventually die. That's because its machinery is taken over by the virus, only working to produce more viruses inside it until it bursts. But as it is being attacked, the cell makes interferon. Interferon affects the surrounding cells by signaling them to shore themselves up against potential viral attack. So in our castle example, interferon is the guy on the top of the castle wall who gets hit by an arrow, but then shouts out to the rest of the castle of an impending attack. No kidding, this is really like war, isn't it? A third part of this second line of innate defense involves white blood cells. They're nonspecific because they will engulf any foreign bacterium or virus they come into contact with. When you studied the types of white blood cells in the last module, you learned that neutrophils are phagocytes. They aren't the most ravenous ones because they're small, but they're often the first white blood cells to arrive at the infection site. Then monocytes arrive. These are the larger cells that are highly phagocytic. Remember when they enter body tissues, they're renamed macrophages. Other white blood cells, called basophils, encourage inflammation by releasing inflammatory chemicals like histamines. In the same line of innate defense, you have natural killer cells. They are lymphocytes that fight tumor cells and cells that are infected by viruses. You have lots of different kinds of lymphocytes in your body, and natural killer cells are just one type. You also have eosinophils that are part of this innate response. Eosinophils reduce inflammation so that it doesn't continue indefinitely. You see, too much inflammation can cause damage to tissues, so eosinophils secrete enzymes that break down the inflammatory agents released by white blood cells. Now, I want to talk a bit more about inflammation. It's an important part of the second line of innate defense. It's likely you've experienced inflammation or redness and swelling if you've ever had an ant bite or a mosquito or bee sting. At first, you feel pain. Then you notice the area begins to swell up. It may also appear reddish in color and feel warm. That's because inflammation causes more blood to flow to the area of injury. As I just mentioned, inflammation is caused by basophils and similar cells called mast cells. Mast cells are found deep in the skin and release histamines, prostaglandins, and leukotrienes. All of these chemicals cause the blood vessels to get larger. The technical term for this is vasodilation. If the vessels enlarge, then more blood will flow through them. That brings more complement in to help fight off the infection. When capillaries dilate, they become more porous, so it's much easier for the phagocytic cells to leave the bloodstream and enter the surrounding infected tissues. Complement kills invading cells, and it signals for phagocytes to enter the tissues. There are actually two types of inflammation. The first is local inflammation. It occurs when infections are being fought in one area of the body, such as with a bee sting. Systemic inflammation, on the other hand, is inflammation that occurs all over the body. You may have felt this type of inflammation when you have had the flu. Your whole body aches. That's because your body is fighting an infection all over it, and thus it is inflamed all over too. Often during systemic inflammation, the body has a fever. A fever is caused as a result of foreign invaders in your body that produce chemicals called pyrogens, or fever-causing agents. Pyrogens are chemicals that promote fever by acting on the hypothalamus. Your own body sometimes will cause a fever. The white blood cells can release pyrogens to increase body temperature a bit. The pyrogens make their way to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is responsible for body temperature control. So is fever a good thing? Actually, for the most part, yes it is. You see, chemical reaction rates speed up at higher temperatures, so a fever speeds up the rate of immune response in the body. White blood cell mitosis occurs faster, and complement and/or interferon is made faster too. More inflammatory chemicals are made as well. Add to this the fact that most invading microorganisms don't like higher temperatures, and you can see that increased body temperature is also helpful in fighting off infection.